Merry Christmas, everyone, and happy holidays. That weirdly enough has been attacked as a terminology, while forgetting that in Christian tradition and across large swathes of Catholic Europe, such as Spain, Italy, and Poland, the Nativity is just the beginning of the Christmas season. There is the Epiphany. There is actually a broader, also this, after the Advent as a separated a season, as a matter of fact, that has a specific set of holidays, right, and that you should be proudly tell to everyone. Today, I want to fittingly make a video about Christian Europe. We never really made sort of an overarching overview of its history, even though we made really hundreds of videos about Christian history, mostly from about ancient medieval Europe. Now, today I will sort of address sort of the general picture, also in a pan-Christian sense, as far as confessional divides. For today, like, we bury the hatchet, so to say. Not that in an unavoidably unitary sense there was ever this much chagrin, especially considering the dire state of sort of spirituality in the world anyway. And we start really from the basics. I will be commenting on certain aspects, make some considerations. This is a video, by the way, that I'm recording on December the 23rd, right? So I've taken my time also for my own Christmas, as a matter of fact, with sort of prepared videos, just as the one that you've seen this night, or wherever you are, because I scheduled it for midnight Central European time. Now, Christianity, obviously, I will say sort of many obvious things today, but you would be really surprised by the wide amount of, especially younger people, that have absolutely no clue about what we're discussing. Hence, I thought this video could be fundamental and sort of explicative of why Europe is Christian. And this is a starting point to reinforce, especially like all the Christian and even pre-Christian Catholic tradition. I'm saying that for what I just said, I really refer you my videos on the subject, because yes, Catholicism does predate Christianity, and the fact that many people do not know what I mean is the measure of complete sort of lack of interest or culture in history of religion. But Christianity, and that's what we focus on, right? We're not making much comparative sort of history of religion here, but originated, as you know, in the mid-3rd century as a Jewish sect in the Roman province of Judea, as far as we can just simply historically document, but we know that obviously this had been quite fundamentally born at the beginning of the century itself, for obvious reasons, and emerging in that later time from the life and teachings, in fact, of Jesus of Nazareth, whose birth is commemorated at Christmas, and whose crucifixion and resurrection form the core of faith celebrated at Easter. That is actually the most important festival, as you know, in Christian holidays. And that, why not, we'll make in the next months like some content about this. Now, from its beginnings, the new religion spread rapidly through the missionary force of apostles such as Paul and Peter, who proclaimed the gospel across the Roman Empire, establishing communities in key cities at the time, the Roman Empire and the broader Hellenistic world, Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, and Rome, right? Paul's epistles, written in the 50s and the 70s to churches in Hellas and Rome, represented some of the earliest Christian writings, emphasizing themes of grace, redemption, and ethical living that appealed widely. Today, we will not talk so much about theology per se, just like a history of Christian Europe. As you know, in my content, you find plenty of explanations about this in a strictly theological, metaphysical, spiritual sense, so I don't have to present it. I think it's sort of obvious. Again, this is the obvious ABC part. I don't know how much I will digress in something deeper throughout the video, because it's still like alone Christian history in Europe, something so big that it's important just to even simply acknowledge the macroscopic scale of it. And as you know, despite intense persecution, Christians were blamed for disasters targeted under emperors like Nero following the Great Fire of Rome in 64, and subjected to executions. The faith's message of hope, charity, and the inherent dignity of every human life drew converts from all social classes. Its opposition to practices such as infanticide, abortion, gladiatorial games, and polygamy, while promoting monogamous marriage and care for widows and orphans, distinguished it ethically in the ancient world, so important to agree. Early followers carried the theology of Jesus throughout the empire and beyond, with its unique values fostering growth, despite refusals to worship emperors. I made lots of videos in particular showing how, in spite of persecutions, that were una tantum in any case, they were definitely not the norm. Most of early Christian history was not affected by persecutions, if not sort of in a broader moral, but not in a direct sense. They were episodic, often also not uniform across the empire, and actually Christians were fully integrated within the Roman Empire and its central institutions, in the army, right? And there was an overwhelming support towards Rome that had not just become the resting place of St. Peter and St. Paul, and so the foundational center of what was seen increasingly as an imperial church, but in this sense fully backing the effort of a great Catholic empire in universal ecumenic terms like Rome was. And this is very notorious if you have some basic understanding of early Christian literature, apologetics, patristics, and so on. You can check all of that in my ancient, in this case, Christianity playlist. Now, the church began as a network of believers distinct from political authority. This is also foundational, and it will always stay the same. A big mistake people think is that at some point, I don't know, in the modern, even it could be before, also the modern separation, at some point, church and state and Christianity were united, right? And this is a gross misunderstanding of the very foundations of what properly the church is, that is to say, definitionally always separated from any earthly institution. And what people really mean is that some states, as actually most of them are, like as with an official religion in Europe, as of course the Christian one, regardless of the confession, are Christian in the sense that people who found it and live in them are Christian largely, but never was it at any point, the church fused with the state or anything like that. There could be a cooperation in a Christian world with the two authorities, as we'll see now, church and empire, will always cooperate, even when they were competing and in conflict with one another, to, by the way, a massive, as we'll see later, enormous civilizational offshoot just deriving from this antagonism at some point that is really unique in the West and mirroring actually how effective the evolution of church and state separately was at this point. So you've been mostly, if you never heard of this notion, you've been told that at some point up to, 100, 200 years ago, church and state were united. No, right? There wasn't such a thing like the two things overlapping. That is metaphysically, ecclesiologically, even secularly impossible, all right, by definition. Church and state in Christianity were always separated, by definition, all right? And what you're told mostly is just you don't want to have the state being religious or Christian. That's a completely different thing. And the church, in this early period, gradually carved out social spaces of independence that, in fact, even revolutionized family and community structures, allowing, for example, women to participate in religious life as diaconesses, at least in the early centuries, with ordination rites persisting in Eastern traditions into later periods, and providing financial support for widows independent of remarriage while forbidding cohabitation outside marriage and elevating monogamy as a standard that offered greater security than the pre-Christian norms, where widows faced pressure to remarry or quickly or lose estates, and the sort of pre-existing double standards allowing, for example, married men extramarital relations, which naturally can be debated in a sort of social, cultural sense, historically speaking. It's not like the pre-Christian world was insensitive to certain issues, but it was differently regulated. Famously, Armenia marked a historic milestone by adopting Christianity as its state religion in 301 AD, building Etchmiadzin Cathedral as the world's oldest state-constructed church and seat of the Armenian Apostolic Church, which belongs to Oriental Orthodoxy with a large majority there. The Roman Empire's official embrace came in 380 under Theodosius I, made, of course, lots of videos about him also for this reason, with decrees against non-Christians and heretics, including vehement language and harsh penalties following Constantine's pivotal Edict of Milan in 313, which ended, famously enough, persecution and allowed public worship, and his conversion, which transformed Christianity from a marginal sect into the empire's dominant force through church-building programs, making Sunday a day of rest initially for urban dwellers and establishing Constantinople as a new Christian capital in 330, rivaling Rome with its Eastern Patriarch. We should explain, of course, that Christianity was not simply a minority fringe, if not in a fringe, maybe just in a social, economical sense, before, especially the Edict of Tolerance by Constantine, and by the time of Theodosius really being integral part also of the entire secular world. Because remember that there is a difference between lay and secular. Within the same within the same church, you have the secular clergy, say bishops, those who have properly to cope with the public world with imperial authority, by the way, and for example, the monks that choose like another path, as we'll see now, within the same. Now, the first council of Nicaea in 325, famously convened by Constantine holding the Creed, unified core doctrines, producing the Nicene Creed, in fact, that affirmed Christ's divinity, right, that had been challenged by especially Arianism, and established unity amid earlier controversies, while the Creed was later expanded at Constantinople in 381 to address further theological points on the Holy Ghost. There is, of course, a rich conciliar history, and especially one triggered by Eastern issues, because the Eastern churches, as a matter of fact, were actually the most unstable. As we will see now, the West had a much more successful upholding of orthodoxy in the West. Always remember, I don't think I should repeat this, but you know that the official name of any of the major, also of the Orthodox Church, is Catholic since inception. All right, Catholic is the truly universal, official, formal, standard, institutional term of the Church. Right, there isn't such a thing like the Catholic Church as opposed to separated from the Orthodox one. This is conventional terminology that has nothing to do with the official meaning of the same. Equally Orthodox simply standing for the doctrinally orthodox. So obviously also the Catholic Church is an Orthodox church, regardless also of what the Orthodox really think in that regard. But as you know, on Schwerpunkt we made really lots of videos about the truly Catholic continuity of the Latin Celto-Germanic Christianity in the West as one of dramatic stability and civilizational success, right? That derives deeply also from topics that now we're not simply discussing, the same relation with the empire. And so when the western half of the empire, in an administrative sense, because there was still a Roman Empire intended as imperium, as in that sense taken over by the various Germanic tribes that had settled in the West, and continuing, in fact, greatly the Roman states that had existed up to that point with a social-cultural blending was immediate and incredibly successful. Where after 476 formally, the Catholic Church provided this incredibly successful continuity and authority, not just of itself, but of civilization entire. There wasn't a disconnection there between the church and the rest of society. Everything was, as we were saying before, Christian, regardless of the separation between the empire and the church. There are some theological aspects we could at some point gladly discuss, such as at some point the church to hold functionally some secular power of essentially imperial nature. Equally, kings and emperors at the time believed to a different degree that they had a degree of autonomy from the church as far as the connection with God was concerned, but this could never be fully separated, simply because the estates that constituted traditional society always entailed a nobility with a leadership, the clergy, the third estate, and so you cannot gnostically, Cartesianly separate fundamentally these elements from the systems. You have bishops at this point and popes filling leadership voids in military and civil matters, such as when popes controlled Rome in the absence of imperial officials and served as sources of authority during critical transitions, becoming the great power in Italy, especially under Gregory the Great, who dominated the peninsula politically for centuries and looked upon church and state as cooperating in distinct spheres. We never really made a video about Gregory the Great. Of course, we talked about him in the videos about the evangelization of the Anglo-Saxons, in particular the relation with the Longobards that were still nominally Arian. So, enormous figure. In fact, I will start a series now. We can absolutely talk about his contemporary Saint Benedict, but Gregory is really crucial in defining what will be, in fact, a different horizon of evangelization that involved the rural world, right? The Christians had not really very much cared, let's say, in practical secular terms, with all the things that were happening at the time and the same heresies that had been threatening late antiquity, the same unity of the church and so on, to simply concentrate their force in the evangelization of the countryside. Because even though those were exactly the places that upheld some of the most superstitious beliefs that in fact were normally looked upon with disdain by the same older pre-Christian establishment that was truly Catholic, if you understand what that means. At this point, and this is a bit like what would happen more in the Byzantine world, like the difference between the Hellenistic world and the Roman, the Latin one, is incredibly important because the Romans engineered truly also the continental dimension of Europe. It's interland, large masses, millions of people. The Eastern Church was more separated from the interland to an extent, and also politically speaking, the Byzantine Empire was mostly controlling a very specifically coastal, maritime connected dimension of the empire, still connected with some of the bigger cities, but something that now was basically degrading because of the great crisis like of late antiquity, the beginning of what we call the Middle Ages, that really required, and this was the genius of Gregory the Great and Saint Benedict, that is the patron of Europe for this reason, that the true force that could be unlocked in potential from the general promise of the Evangelion was among the peasantry, was among these masses. And monasteries were the tool there. Monasteries inspired by Saint Benedict's rule of 530 emphasized chastity, obedience, poverty, work, and prayer. After rigorous training, becoming bastions of stability, where monks preserved ancient manuscripts, copying works of Greco-Roman authors along scripture, thus safeguarding classical knowledge through the so-called Dark Ages, and serving as models of economic resourcefulness through skills in animal husbandry, cheese making, wine production, tanning, fulling cloth, crushing with sieving flour, and various industries that spread techniques across Europe as monasteries functioned like model factories with water power driving machinery and practically all floors and high industrial technology facilitating diffusion. Naturally, regarding the latter point, I'm talking mostly the high and late Middle Ages, because in St. Benedict's time there was really a scarcity of resources, and that's also why these monasteries were operating next to the rural communities. What is important here to stress is that this abstinence that monastic life entailed was not at all intended to be separated from the saeculum, right? Contrary to some common belief, like monasteries were not isolated from the world. The monks traveled a lot and they interacted with local communities for probably the sake of helping them. And in general, asceticism, this isolation, there are, as you know, from the desert fathers, the desert intended probably as the desertum, right? They started releasing from desertic places like in Egypt, like in Syria and so on. But desertum in Latin means literally properly that it's not a place that is not populated. And in the West was plenty of these places. And our, in this sense, monastic map of Europe, as you know, is incredibly thick, incredibly detailed. There was a precedent to this, right? In Roman times, we've seen it in the video about Montjoie Saint-Denis, that there, in fact, shows how abbeys were following in the wake of the great imperial Catholic tradition that Rome had upheld. Basically, every mountaintop was dedicated to God, to Jupiter, and the entirety of Europe was dotted, like this is not even beyond the empire, with specific communities, citadels, holy places, shrines on which now also the Christian ones were established. The same goes for churches with temples in the cities, as you know very well. And Europe literally explodes with this stuff, like Western Europe, Southern Europe, having the greatest also archaeological certification in this regard. And the point of monastic asceticism was essentially exemplary. It was a way to show discipline in times of hardships, but also one that was intended for some preparation that would eventually lead monks, for example, to pursue actually a secular career, and so coming back to the world to change it. So the heavy abstinence was mostly a sort of preparation for something greater. This was pursued also in military terms with the later monastic military orders. Think about Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the Templar, and etc. made, obviously, as a military history channel, lots of videos in this. Whereas, of course, the world had to grow, and the monastery represented a earthly paradise, so a heavenly model to imitate, but in this sense, it could be imitated only to the degree by which it was known. In fact, some of the most important centers of monastic life in the West were deeply connected also with specific episcopal careers. Just to make an example, the Lorraine Islands in Provence, close face of Cap d'Antibes, where Napoleon landed before the 100 days, were very hermetic places, literally island in the midst of the sea, that prepared monks to eventually become some of the highest clergy in the entire empire, namely the one of Arles, that had the prefecture of the Gauls, right, after Trier had been sort of demoted from that because of barbarian incursions on the Rhine. Now, these monastic communities were destined to advance agriculture, medicine, and crafts, operating hospitals, orphanages, and hospices that embodied Christian charity. The famous Xenodokia, you have figures like Saint Basil establishing formal systems of care in the 4th century. It was a big welfare system run by the church. Like the emperors would make donations, but essentially the church would mostly take care of all this mechanism. Also think about pilgrims that came to Rome. For example, Rome in this sense was full of hospitals, of hospices, of recovery. And also just the social conditions of the time that, as you know, had drastically worsened, right, and would essentially bring to this widespread poverty in the following centuries due to literally the exhaustion of classical antiquity and mostly the moral dimension of it. It's not like resources weren't quite there, but the means to properly use them had basically been exhausted by that fall that had begun just for Christianity to come to try to fix it in a spiritual sense at the end of antiquity, just like also by classical prophecy. And you have really this incredibly complex system, like including soup kitchens, medical centers open to all regardless of faith, indistinguishable in this sense also in digestive systems, while Pope Gregory the Great in the late 6th century administered strict reforms as a trained lawyer and administrator, a great continuity, especially in that case, from the highest nobility of the empire into probably the episcopal ranks. And that's why Gregory is all the more relevant for having understood the new focus of of the faith, not simply the elite. And at this point was decaying as well in a more fractal dimension across the empire. But in fact, the unity, the common bulk, right, of the population, and how this also interacted with the elites, with the aristocracy that managed the war. He fought heresies like Arianism and Donatism, pacified invading forces such as the Longobards, revised the liturgy, and influenced music through antiphonal chants that developed the Gregorian traditions and left famous examples of penitence for crimes. And so actually you see also the relation with the Germanic peoples here being quite positive in the West, like the notion that some barbarians would have come from anywhere just to destroy Romans is completely false. Like there's no evidence whatsoever the Germans had been gravitating actually within the empire, the imperial sphere of influence. From half of a millennium, they were fully sort of substituting themselves to the evaporating imperial force and ruling over, again, harmoniously over these societies. The only issues that ever happened was mostly internal within them, some Aryan clashes between the nobility and so on, but we don't have in the West any major let's say, demonstration of intolerance, destruction. Say, barbarians, of course, as they were passing by, destroyed. But when they had to settle, they of course, highly preserved everything they had under control. That was their main goal, as a matter of fact. We've seen it just, the other day in the video about the Franks. That's been an incredibly tough time for everybody involved. It was essentially no winner. The affirmation of Christianity here was to heal the wounds of this world, shattered by migrations, invasions, plague, war of all kind, like general sort of moral collapse that translated into a societal one. But the relation between all these forces was very constructive. And this is, in fact, one of the most underrated times in Western history. The early Middle Ages saw comprehensive Christianization across Europe, with missionaries converting Germanic tribes, Slavs, Scandinavians, and others, often through royal conversions like Clovis of the Franks in 496, that brought the entire kingdoms into the faith and integrated them into Christendom, with Baltic completion only in the 15th century as an exception that confirms the rule. The Lithuanians, famously being the last to convert to Christianity in Europe from probably pre-book religious influence, we would like really to point out that most of these conversions were, first of all, and this is really almost the complete norm, starting from within the same peoples, right? Missionaries entered, but in that sense, there was not a violent conquest or imposition. What you think with Saxons and Charlemagne, aside from the fact that that was, normally, what Saxons and Franks did with one another from many centuries, is the most brutal picture. There were, of course, civil wars within, say, Scandinavia. You have St. Olaf, Norway, also. In Britain, you have these figures that obviously sort of fought, died, and killed themselves in order to impose their own regime, entailing Christianity and conversion. But at large, Christianity spread autonomously, spread spontaneously, right? Conversion was mostly peaceful, regardless of also the crisis, the broader problems of wars of those times that were, say, not particularly funested as they had been during the migration era, with major displacements, ravages, and so on, but obviously had their own instability that Christianity fixed, because essentially with the church arrived also more monarchic, a more robust monarchic regime, better administration. Overall, European civilization was stepping up. So again, it's not like people lived better before Christianity, places like Scandinavia, or Poland, to just make an example. Now, the Carolingian era under Charlemagne, crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD in Rome, in fact by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, fused Christian mission with political unity, right? Promoting education and literacy through subsidized schools, protecting the poor through economic reforms, and expanding faith through conquests, as we were saying before, the Saxons, the Low Countries, essentially the Frisians, also northern and central Italy. They were already Catholic countries, but they had now also sort of threatened to an extent papal autonomy, or at least mostly that the Frankish faction had won in Rome instead of the Longobard one. It was the Lombards would have done it by themselves. The entire notion that the Longobards were enemies of the Pope because they were Arians or even pagans, it's complete nonsensical. They were fully Catholic and actually very well allied both with the papacy and the Franks, say in the era of Charles Martel, so contributing to the struggle against the Islamic invasions. We will see now. But obviously, the greatness of the Carolingian Empire, the idea of Charlemagne as father of Europe as well, like this, we're talking about Christian Europe, we're talking Christian history in Europe, but what is Europe, right, historically? Europe already existed at different levels and in ways that also without labels have beginning to stratify from a very long time. You can draw it back to probably the Indo-European conquest. We talked about this greatly at length. Those very beliefs had historically been Catholic since ever. Christianity was just another place of provenance, but it was fully in the wake of that Catholic tradition, and especially in the West, was heavily informed by its Roman essence, to say the least, right? If you look at the papacy. So it's a big deal. The Carolingian Empire was truly Roman, regardless of what is normally said, that this was a mock empire, whatever. Like the Byzantine legalistic pattern was not, would have never been accepted even by, archaic Rome regarding what the imperium, which is a metaphysical thing, is the same Holy Ghost, theologically speaking, would be limited to in their opinion. So we should recover the roots of Europe also in as much as what it means for Europe to have Christianized at this point in history, and also for the Western Empire to have provided with the most solid Christian orthodoxy, differently from the Byzantine East that had, as you know, huge issues, not much because of the Islamic invasions, but the fact that the Islamic invasions had been favored by Christian elements at the time in the East. So the history of Western civilization that to a degree has been vituperated by a very specific sort of ideological side of the aisle, let's put it in this way, at this point is obviously coming back a bit at the center of the equation, but we should understand better its foundations, because it's as if in the process even conservative people have forgotten this. Like there are some foundational traditional values of European identity that are not merely accidental or descriptive, right? If someone else would make a video about, say, Christian Europe, like this one, it would just give you some, touristic information kind of explanation. Instead, it's really important to understand how metaphysically and foundationally constitutive the centrality of Roman Christian history has always been, and for a reason. Right? If you don't recover this, it's a bit difficult to understand Christianity itself, right? And unfortunately, again, also Christianity has tended to slide towards this mostly identitary group thing, as opposed to understanding the deeper, again, metaphysical meaning of what that is supposed to mean, also in continuity with those previous cults. This is something that you will surely never hear, if not oppositionally. Like things like, Christianity copied everything from the other religions. People do not understand that it was just one religion in the world, and there were just different ways to God from different peoples, from different background. But the universal and Catholic meanings, including how the same Romans before Christian times burned people for witchcraft, were already there. Right, and it's a complete myth to presume that we're talking about two different things. It was never, ever properly a cut to begin with, regardless of the enormous changes that occurred naturally from pre-Christian to Christian times. But here we're talking, again, the Carolingian Empire, mostly in this sort of, for example, great Christian reform that was a moral one and a spiritual one at large, seeking properly a European uniformity in this great universal Roman Empire, resurrected by the Franks, properly as God's chosen people, just like the Romans had been for the ultimate mission of world conquest. Judicial changes created a more lawful and prosperous realm, including currency standardization, legal principles affirming papal immunity from secular justice. Remember that for those who think that there was no separation between state and church, and founding what some call an early Renaissance with traces enduring in French traditions and profound impression, leaving independent warlords unified even after the end of the, say, at least the Carolingian dominion, because the empire went on institutionally all along, even when emperors were not elected temporarily, were at least very devoid of power output. You realize how sort of in Europe there was a general reflourishing of the system, especially during the 8th, the 9th century from the earlier ones. The concept of Christendom emerged strongly, in fact, in those previous period further, right, as Islam advanced from the 7th century, marginalizing Eastern Christians and prompting defensive responses, including the Crusades from 1096 onward, called by Pope Urban II to aid Constantinople and recover holy lands, centered on Jerusalem's importance in medieval maps and sort of beyond, because there is an archetypal and metaphysical geography of the world. We were talking about this just recently in what was the traditional understanding of space, right? Why was the East so relevant? It was all about the rising path of the sun, of regeneration. In the last episode I made about, in fact, about purification, the phonem P in Indo-European languages, you have the explanation of this mechanism. And also sort of looking at the Crusades, despite military failures, over 4 centuries this thing went on, and more. Actually, the last Crusades were really in the 18th century. If you see sort of other wars fought, we just talked about the Balkan Wars, for example, in a video, the first one at least. Those Balkan sort of clashes against the Ottomans were still seen and blessed as veritable crusades. So that's yet another important aspect of Christian Europe that we should recover, that not just is not ever late for crusades, but that have a very specific traditional meaning as well, but that these things are incredibly recent, right? The Crusades do not stop to what we have decided to outline as the Middle Ages. I'm a medievalist, for those of you who have just subscribed do not know me, so that's my focus. They are actually very much alive, and especially in the aristocratic ethos of the European establishment throughout all the following centuries. And when you look at the Crusades in the Holy Land, so the more conventionally described ones, and also the ones in the Balkans during the 14th and 15th century, they ended in defeat against what was now reactivating at different times as Islamic colossus, reinforcing, however, a shared European religious identity. Right? For example, talking about the Renaissance, we'll get a bit better to later. We would not feel, especially in religious terms, of course, there wasn't much that had to be taught. It's not like the Ottomans made us more foundational Christians than we already were, but it stimulated further the sense of struggle of the faith. I have an entire series on Vienna 1683, if you're interested, that discusses very much these theological aspects, also cultural ones, but in this sense also, and especially as Western Europeans, Central Europeans, we would not understand ourselves in that sort of more also modernly, which doesn't mean in this sense anti-traditional. On the contrary, everything that works is traditional, so also modernity does not really exist in the way we intended as such, right, because of the Ottomans. Right, as a shared enemy, as properly the idea of different spaces that included the Christendom as also the tendentially ecumenic world, so the Societas Christiana, to expand. For say, if you read the Apocalypse, you know that the end time is to arrive only when all peoples have been evangelized. And at this point in history, you can also wonder, what does that mean? Like, they have been presented with Christianity, have met Christianity, because we could be close in that sense, or properly that Christianity has won over the entire system. So, and this is sort of millenaristic concern. We don't have now to discuss it, but it is very important for how Christian culture, in its most vivid sense, up to really few generations ago, really saw itself through that lens and through that ultimate Catholic dimension, even in countries that were not Catholic in that sense. And so definitely the protracted clash with Islam reinforced a shared European religious identity. It stimulated cultural exchange through renewed interest in classical learning. Remember that the notion that Europeans suddenly sort of started writing more and creating, libraries, cathedrals, and so on, it would have been sort of an effect of exposure or in the sense passive exposure to Greek, Arab texts of the old, mostly Hellenistic tradition. Leaving aside the Byzantine Empire, where that had basically all maintained preserved, but not so studied like in the West. In the West, we literally knew already how to do it on their own. We had our own centers of translation from the Greek, from the Arabic. We went over to those libraries in places that maybe had yet to be reconquered. At some point in Toledo, in the east, we have the Reconquista, the Italian Maritime Republic, simply knowing already in the West. There are very famous figures in this sense, Petrus Lombardus, and so on, that literally knew that in advance, where to find, what to find, because they already knew that, right? They weren't searching for something. They already had massive amount of literary material, massive and higher level of education, and went pick those old manuscripts reconstituting, for example, Roman law that in the Byzantine Empire was never, for example, fully redone. That's a hallmark of the West, showing that actually the cultural shift, historically speaking, was in radical, magnitudinal, scalar favor of the West from a very long time. It's very, very, very debatable to presume that at any point after the fall of the western half of the Roman Empire, the West was more backwards. Actually, it made lots of videos and explaining in great depth and length what kind of perspectives made them understand this. Especially, again, the Mediterranean world naturally was more advanced. If we pick Anglo-Saxon Britain, of course, you can debate how sort of particularly more advanced than places like, the Byzantine Empire were. But even there, actually, if you look at the models of education, of cultural organization, you realize, for example, say Anglo-Saxon England, as sort of the least performing of the post-Roman countries in the West, was still incredibly autonomous, liberal, in a properly classical sort of literary sense. Think about Bede the Venerable, think about all the various monastic centers of learning, how history was written, how this is something, and for not talking about Gaul or Italy, etc. Like, these places were dramatically advanced, and at no point in history you can actually claim that in Constantinople they had something as advanced as that. This is actually a legacy of antiquity. Many people think that the East was simply more culture, but if you really look at the great Hellenistic libraries of the Eastern, of the Levant, you realize that nobody accessed them. There were big magazines frequented una tantum by some courtly scholar to make sort of minimal research, and nobody accessed this. Nobody read those things. Like, there was some general literary development, education, and so on in society. But this is nothing in comparison to properly the approach to wisdom, to knowledge in the West. It was actually the Romans in Rome, in Italy, who held public readings in libraries where many people were properly exposed to knowledge. And the West simply continued like that as a properly definitional character of itself at this time, where Christian culture was also preserving much of classical knowledge on their own. So we may have had, I'm actually very convinced of this after sort of decades studying this stuff, that there is a massively skewed misunderstanding and even purposed alienation in accepting that the West was way more advanced than we have been told, that under any point of view. Even, I don't know, material culture is a bit difficult to see. I don't know, like the Italian peninsula lagging behind to compare to, I don't know, the Byzantine coastal world. This is, in which other term, art, law, urbanization, literacy per capita. Well, this is also very notorious, but for some reason we thought of the West just like a sort of dark place with smoky mud hut, at some point in the early Middle Ages. This is not really what it was really about, nor, by the way, the rest of the world was particularly more advanced at any point. There were surely some places that individually were more advanced, as we said before. But, right, the notion that the West was lagging behind and suddenly reinvigorated by some sort of Eastern influence is not correct, right? There's no doubt that it was great exchange, stimulation, even the same war, even the same conflict helps, as we were saying before. But it's not because there was simply an osmosis from sort of some overwhelmingly more developed civilization. The golden age of Islam is definitely overrated if you look at how they inherited, first of all, the Hellenistic model themselves in knowledge preservation. And while they had places like, I don't know, for example, the Khorasan, that was actually a wilder place than most places in Europe, but provided great geniuses. Perhaps they are probably at the frontier that had something to do. They provided with many more scholars than the Abbasids of Baghdad in Iraq really would. So it's not that obvious that very important centers or places would necessarily be more advanced. Bigger doesn't necessarily mean more qualitative. This could be said for many of these realities. The Latin Germanic West had a much thicker social-cultural fabric than any other of these civilizations ever had at any point of their history, in this, in fact, especially in the post-Christian era. But going back to the Crusades, obviously, these expeditions involved ideas of holy war that were already there. Other big myth is that holy war was simply invented at the time of the Crusades by the Pope. It was all there. Every single literal thing was already used. The Crusades already existed. And I mean literal crusades, also the more conventional, this had been waged in Spain and in the Western Mediterranean. But there is, again, probably some internal distribution of historiographical or cultural sort of awareness in the world. I say in the West because as Westerners, we dominated the world, so basically the world is heavily Westernized and goes along our own, what we hold it to think. But in that sense, minimal sort of differences within even European scholarship may have skewed like a certain understanding of which country was doing what and so on. And this is unfortunately true also at the detriment of the plenitude of European civilization at the time. And these ideas of holy war were obviously part of the broader chivalry rooted not just in Christian love and self-sacrifice, exemplified by Saint Francis of Assisi, who actually went over to the Crusades, and when you read in his story like that he criticized them, he was criticizing them because they didn't do it well enough, not because he was criticizing violence. Let's also debunk this complete nonsensical idea that the Christians at any point here were sort of claiming that you didn't have to use military force in a riotous, divinely led fashion. And principles that had historically been there since the equestrian ethos of the Indo-European conquerors that flowed freely also across all these traditions since antiquity, was there from millennia. The same holy war provided paradoxically foundations for concepts of tolerance that didn't quite exist, especially in the modern sense that we attributed to tolerance, but let's say in terms of coexistence, in terms of not organic integration of some superior and inferior culture and role of dominance and nurturing. This was definitely there, right? This was showed also by the Muslims that there was a capacity to have sort of different regions, even in Europe, were different. We've seen it even up to the Renaissance. And our recent video about Gonzalo de Cordoba, the Gran Capitan, were great part of, actually European, because those, even by ancestry, were European, but still, for example, Muslim communities. This was typical of the areas in particular that had remained, in fact, under Islamic control up to very recently. Just mostly, the Iberian Peninsula is the major landmass, historically Sicily, but up to the 11th century. This was true also from the other side, and so you have actually in the same Holy Land some relative peaceful coexistence at some point with some Islamic powers. This brought to the force to define coexistence and legal limits. Think about Frederick II that ransomed Jerusalem from the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, without bloodshed. That was something also the papacy was not particularly happy of, because, again, the same papacy, of course, righteously called for holy war and reconquest of the holy places in the expansion of Christendom. But naturally, if you know the political history of Frederick II, you understand also what was happening there. It was very difficult to make a headway, especially after the loss of Jerusalem to Saladin back in the day, in that particular context. But it's more. Like, this video, again, is not about medieval civilization per se, but it's necessary in order to understand the history of Christianity to have a very deep, extensive and intensive understanding of European history and culture, because otherwise it doesn't make any sense, right? Now, monasteries and cathedral schools evolved into the first universities as well. Bologna in 1088, specializing in law through canon and civil studies, attracting students across borders with international reach. Paris around the mid-12th century in theology, under Notre Dame's influence, the most important theological center. In that sense, rivaling with Bologna was mostly about law and holding, quote, liberal debates. Notre Dame was, of course, the Sophia Perennis, and so the transfigured soul, like the Virgin Mary, but in that sense, the soul of the hero, that transfigured from sort of the darker origin of the feminine principle, properly infused with the virtue of the father, in fact, bringing the victorious hero to heaven, is the soul of chivalry, the deepest meaning of the Virgin, right, which most people have no clue of, by the way. Oxford in 1096, where clerics harmonized faith with reason, drawing on Aristotle via Arab translations to produce scholastic masterpieces like Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. Twice as master at Paris, synthesizing Christian doctrine with classical philosophy and emphasizing reason as compatible with revelation. While natural law theories laid foundation for later human rights ideas derived from eternal law woven into human nature and expanded by later thinkers like Grotius, building secular versions. This aspect is very important because although there is a general sense that, again, yes, humanity degrades towards the abyss, and in the end time, there must be the final struggle, the victory of Christ, and so on. Let's say scholastics is an incredible reminder of how European civilization could think a unitary understanding of the cosmos at every level of its physical and metaphysical understanding, with a shared, probably Western identity and system of scientific and moral mechanisms that today no country on Earth is minimally able to achieve alone. You can look at Europe and say we are definitely the best equipped to do so, and I really think and hope, and even Schwerpunkt is a sort of modest contribution on how to sort of acknowledge, in fact, how powerful our tradition is in this regard and how much can be repeated. Now, Christianity deeply molded European law and ethics, as you obviously understand, with canon law forming the West's first modern legal system and oldest continuously functioning one in the West, regulating organization, government, and Catholic activities towards mission with own courts over education, inheritance, oaths, moral crimes, and marriage, influencing concepts of justice, human rights rooted in divine creation, and natural law as articulated by Aquinas, who taught that just leadership pursues the common good, and that laws must align with reason to be valid, providing a presumption in favor of preserving life balanced with circumstances not vitalistic or quality-based. This is incredibly relevant because you understand this is not a free check on humanity, as most people would like also, and abhorrently so, Christianity to be. Christianity has nothing to do with that. Christianity tells us that we are as humans in a pretty dire condition, and that if you want to come out of it of the same, you must follow a particular path, right? There is probably not even a discouraging in following Christ's footsteps. That's the actual purpose. Let's not talk the theological issues, the value of works. I promised I wouldn't make sort of much of a of a criticism of different interpretations. Let's put it this way to be generous, all right? But there is a duty as much as there is a right. So humanity is elevated because of the inherent spark of divinity present in all of us, and so the possibility to enhance that to an incredible level. And this, as we will see partially now, also there is a whole history of sainthood that leads into probably all the various examples of European tradition, and align also with the concept of the heroic one from the pre-Christian era as well, right? There is all an geography that shows how this, say, the force once held by mankind deteriorates, and so Christianity comes to a point saying, okay, look, that if you fix on a spiritual dimension, you can re-achieve in this sort of great ascetic condition of civilization after the fall of the greater ecumenic empire, to sort of prepare for reasserting this power to spring out again. In great many ways, Western civilization did so already and continues doing that, especially when properly motivated by, in fact, a leadership. You understand here that was not a leaderless world, it was a heavily hierarchical system, but also a mass to redeem, to be offered the option of proving themselves victorious in front of God. And this passes also in European history through the military as well. Like there are the most successful times in European civilization being exactly about an enlightened elite understanding when to unlock those resources of the dispossessed, of those who have something to prove, because they have the potential to do so, and achieving this in unity. And it's very important today, for example, with the war in Ukraine. So also the entire notion that Christianity would be some kind of weakening force or whatever is completely detached from any theological evidence. Humanity weakens itself by itself gradually, and this was believed by everybody in Christian times and pre-Christian times in a sort of eschatological sense to begin with. And if you don't know what the metaphysical preconditions of this, what the fall means, and how that's not something that happened at some point and we're statically here. We're continuously degenerating exclusively for our own fault, right? This was believed also by the Indo-Europeans, for that matter. The fact that this was some kind of Semitic injection that polluted the European. This has absolutely nothing to do with Christianity. Not even really if you study Judaism. That definitely is more skewed if you think about the poem of Gilgamesh in the Semitic world compared to the European beliefs. Of course, there is a divide between the two, but it's still about what you do. It is the transcendental dimension, and Christianity in the West really and particularly understood this meaning, and our Roman way to Christianity is particularly aware of this. That's why also works are a bit the proof of that. Denying the power of works, doesn't matter how infinite in comparison like divine power is also a bit like saying, whatever you do that literally does not matter at all. And so what's the point of it all to begin with? Besides, for the same reasons we just pronounced, the church condemned slavery in various forms over the centuries. It's already the case that from antiquity, some parts of Europe, especially in the northeast, witnessed slavery up to, say, the 18th century or something. But the Already the tendency in late antiquity was to have essentially absorbed slaves of either of conquest or, by social standard, the fourth estate that technically was also in other continents not even counted as, in fact, as people, was absorbed in more like a serfdom. And in part, Christianity had to do with this, because the idea is that in every being, in any case, there was a potential. This was also expressed, for example, by Mithraism. So the idea that, again, Christianity was just making a favor to the weak for some reason does not align with literally some of the most hardcore militaristic sort of Catholic cults like Mithraism, that literally said that from a stone, so from much less than a slave, actually, Mithras would become the sun himself. Now, the church condemned slavery in various forms over centuries, with popes issuing bulls against the trade from the 15th century onward, like Sublimis Deus in 1537, affirming indigenous souls as immortal, or at least for what it was understood in, at least through sort of the doctrine of the time, because this varied also over time, and at least immortal in the sense that they can always have a connection with the divinity, that God's power is never out of reach of any dissolution of life, right? This is a slightly theological sort of digression, but it's important to understand, because it's not like the soul is immortal, like Plato believed simply. Because in all of this, there had been a great blending of Platonic and Aristotelian ideas, but the soul was understood as immortal because it could be resurrected in any case, even when it had dissolved after the failure in the second death. And so basically what we would understand as remaining to hell. And so these are the years, by the way, of the conquistadores. And actually the empire and the church did an enormous lot to sort of preserve the condition of the natives in America, etc. So it's not really like even here, like the idea that there is something, this is an American thing. In part, some Americanism has affected Europe to the degree that, again, there is this nonsense that Europeans were particularly more into slavery than other countries. Actually, most other places in the world were traumatically much more slavery founded, as in the deepest and most intimate essence of their own cultures, that what the Westerners did, if anything, was the complete opposite in historical hindsight. In fact, as we were saying before, the Sublimis Deus also recognized the indigenous souls as fully immortal, but also fully human, and prohibited their enslavement or robbery. Here we're also going by theme, not necessarily by chronology. I mean, we're following it loosely. But for example, in Supremo Apostolatus in 1839, the papacy condemned all forms of slavery with profound sorrow for past involvement, acknowledging early tolerance, but later softening manners through charity, and earlier force alleviating suffering through figures like Peter Claver working for African slaves, and Bathilde outlawing slavery in the Frankish kingdom. So actually, you have an entire history of sort of loosening the most oppressive conditions that were understood as, it's not because people do not deserve, again, some what they get basically from life, but in this sense, there is a divine capacity to be able to redeem and to activate, right? And then if that fails, it's still because of people's fault, not because in that sense, a slave's potential is not, it's not well, inactable, so to say. Now, the faith elevated women's status as well by prohibiting polygamy and infanticide, more likely for females, by the way, condemning marital infidelity, incest, birth control, and abortion. We've seen this stuff, by the way, in the video about the evangelization of the Frisians, that had naturally a Vodanic cult that was in essence universal. It was in essence Catholic historically. In fact, paradoxically, the Vodanic establishment was the one that, as we explained before, actually converted to Christianity more directly. It was the chthonic superstitions of lesser people that actually had the most courageous, and in that sense actually female dominated, feministically profiled actually terrible things like killing children by decision of women, etc. So actually, if you look at Christian culture, there is a lot of reference to virility. There is a lot of reference to this curbing this archetype, sort of non-dignified feminine element in its sort of more tendentially chthonic direction, as instead inverted in Mary, in the angel woman, the divinized woman, that's sparks of as probably the transfigured soul, right? And thanks to her own son, that is also her own father, as a matter of fact, these concepts are actually very present in pre-Christian beliefs. So again, all the I understand there are lots of kids nowadays that are drawn, as we've seen also in the Q&A series, to some sort of idea of emasculizing Christianity. But if you have any minimal theological education, you kind of know essentially what this is all about instead. The Church has established marriage as a sacrament requiring mutual consent from both parties from the 13th century, as it was formalized at councils like Florence in 1438, a special participation in Christ's union with Church overseeing dissolutions and protecting rights in ways that offered greater security than surrounding cultures, with rights for women deacons persisting in some traditions up to the 12th century, and prominent roles for abbesses treating with kings on equal terms, present at solemnities, and deliberating in assemblies. And this was also the archetypal role of woman, definitely subject to virility, but in this sense necessary as well in order to achieve divinity. If you're interested, I just also posted the other day an image with a didascally on X where I showed how Jupiter Dolicanus and Juno Regina are represented historically standing over an ox and a donkey, incarnating respectively, of course, the masculine and feminine principles, holding victory. You have the angel, you have the sacred flames of the Holy Ghost, the eternal life, obviously paralleling the nativity crib where these same gifts are embodied in Christ. So actually the role of the woman was always very important, even when subordinated in a traditional sense to the virile hierarchy. And this is, again, completely normal. It's a hallmark of Indo-European identity, and it was in the deepest soul and heart of Europe since ever, in an incredibly successful and functional sense. Figures like Saint Basil in the 4th century founded hospitals and welfare systems, as we were saying before, while monastic orders provided social services amid plagues and famines, funding them through large estates and collections, acting as early versions of welfare states with food distribution, hostels for pilgrims, care for lepers, orphanages for the young, hospices for the dying, places for the sick of all ages, and reform centers that supplied crucial support during crisis and conducted hospitals on a large scale, with women in religious institutes running many. Art and architecture flourished under church patronage. Gothic cathedrals, just these massive 80 skyscrapers built up in a span of like a couple of centuries. Then we completed them much later because the 14th century crisis kicked in, but still, like, I also made some videos about this. You have Certa with Pythagoras on archivolts in Canterbury as Anglican symbolizing aspiration toward God with their soaring vaults, stained glass depicting biblical stories, in mixtures of styles in places like St. Mark's Basilica, in Venice, St. Peter's, in Rome. There you have, in Gothic architecture, you have particularly the idea that not just the cathedral, of course, is a great symbol of the universe, but that its walls, this is especially probably in the Anglo-French matrix, then Germany acquired that, also most of Western Europe acquired it, but there were different also styles. But the idea that light over white walls that had to look porous and were built with very specific stones was to mean that the structure was actually purely spiritual, was pure light, right? This is the meaning of cathedrals. It owed much more to Constantine's De Musica and other, in fact, Pythagorean works and Neapolitanic ones than, say, for example, Vitruvius's De Architectura. But the beauty, the power of European art, Christian art, sacred art, is really beyond. You can find in so many different dimensions. Illuminated manuscripts, for example, such as the Book of Kells, in the Vienna Dioscorides, with physician portraits preserved, learning with intricate beauty. Painters like Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel with the Creation of Adam, Leonardo da Vinci in The Last Supper, Raphael in his Madonnas, Caravaggio in dramatic biblical scenes, Titian, Botticelli, Fra Angelico, Tintoretto, Bernini in sculptures, Guercino and Rubens depicted narratives with profound humanity and innovation that became celebrated masterpieces of the Renaissance and Baroque years, motivated by Catholic connection to Greek thought. Right? To say Flemish painting is one of my favorite one. In that sense, if you look at the Italian Gothic, you understand even by sheer civilizational scale how the continuity with Rome, with also the papal culture, the papal treasure of knowledge, of administrative capacities, of organization, of art, of theology, would literally have like Rome as the holy city, the most important emanator of civilization across all of Europe. That was historically the case already with the empire. But there is also a reason, in fact, the Italian Renaissance dominated how Italian became the language of modern Europe and the third classical language after Latin and Greek. All right, and you have here like the entire European pride in arts exploding right across the centuries. Composers such as Bach with his Masses and Passions, Handel with Messiah, Mozart with Requiem and Ave Verum Corpus, Vivaldi with Gloria, Pachelbel with Canons, Haydn, Beethoven, Mendelssohn, Liszt, Schubert with Ave Maria, Frank with Panis Angelicus, and Verdi with Sacred Works, creating music integral to worship and the Western canon, admired for emotional and spiritual depth alongside secular brilliance in Christian sacred music tradition. No continent historically has anything remotely comparable to what we created in Europe during Christian tradition and before the same, of course, but in this sense, perfectly blending, perfectly entwining, being the obvious consequence and cause of the other. Scientists and scholars, often clerics, Gregor Mendel pioneering genetics through pea experiments, famously enough, Georges Lemaitre proposing the Big Bang Theory, Jesuits contributing to astronomy, geomagnetism, seismology, solar physics, electricity with Galvani and Volta, radioactivity with Becquerel, anatomy with Vesalius, calculus with Cauchy, biological field research with Albertus Magnus, experimental method with Gostet and Bacon, and numerous discoveries like Grimaldi, Riccioli, Boscovich, Kircher viewed inquiry as glorifying the Creator, contributing to medicine, physics, and mathematics, with clerics founding bases for education and sponsoring universities, regarded as medieval Christian institutions born from cathedral schools continuing monastic learning interests. The Great Schism of 1054 separated Western Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions over doctrinal and authority issues, including the Filioque clause, that is technically, from a strictly theological point of view, not even actually the big deal that people think, in the sense that this is not just to diminish like the likely mistake that was in transcription, but that was evidently also understood in right theological terms, because the Vulgata is these guys did not know how to translate properly from Greek, and in Latin they said that the Father descended from Father and the Son, as opposed to from the Father through the Son. But specifically in Christianity, this is exactly what the same per filium, that would be the correct way, actually stresses, because it's literally Christ. It should be like in the Trinity, also in the pre-Christian concept, as we've seen in the European theology, you have essentially the Trinity with the Father, from which the Holy Ghost proceeds and the Son receives that, right? So in Christianity, the idea is that Christ is such, as Jesus made it into divinity, And so as God himself, like he's still obviously the one that emanates the Holy Ghost. And also in Christianity, it's only through him in that sense you can achieve that, which is also not exclusivistic from the universal, also the pre-Christian concept, as much as he achieved divinity. So it's like saying, so I don't know if Mithras achieved divinity, wasn't basically the same thing. So for those who complain about, but we have to do it only from Christ, he requires a toll for that. No, it's actually the same identical religion that had always existed. If you've stopped for just 1 second realizing what it means, which nobody does, admittedly in this era, like you would actually understand what this is all about. And again, it's also, again, ridiculous to presume that even in the High Middle Ages, like the Western clergy did not know the theological implication of saying in plain Latin filioque as opposed to per filium, all right? And also, by the way, the schism between the two major, the two churches at that point was not even in 1024 to be definitive, right? It sort of just became later, also because the two traditions sort of departed ever more from one another in a broader civilizational sense, and in some way you understand also who had the better of kind of version of the upper hand. Then you have obviously the 16th century Protestant Reformation, introducing further divisions. This was actually the most problematic. However, it should be pointed out that those resources were liberated as opposed to in those individual countries, so in relative terms to them, in order to sort of not to uphold the sort of Christian unity as a whole. And so the imperial Catholic tradition, again, we have lots of videos of how this happened during the modern age, did revitalize education. Right, this was already a thing in the era anyway, like literacy through vernacular Bible translations like Luther's German version, and ideas of individual conscience influencing what we call democracy, which is actually a misnomer, and I don't have time to digress on that, but say, so it's more like an egalitarian sense of how good that people should be, not the demos being in charge, which is a completely, in fact, sort of also Marxian influence terminology here, as well as economics, with Luther, by the way, separating religious and worldly realms through the two kingdoms doctrine and priesthood of all believers, apprehending lay roles, allowing congregation election of ministers and judgment of doctrines. Calvin, sort of even more radical, promoting separation of powers, elected leaders, and resistance to what were defined as ungodly rulers through lesser magistracies, and Huguenots developing synods for church governance that influenced self-ruling colonies like Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, practicing this, again, misnomer, quote-unquote, democratic forms, as which in this sense align also with a more sort of diluted standard and quality of the ministry, forms as God's will with social contract, right? It's not, as you will see now, like the Church of Rome had not been doing this, actually, as we pointed out, and also throughout the same, even before the Protestant Reformation, there is this kind of but it happened because the Church was like this and like that, but actually the Roman Church was far spreading literacy in the 15th. This is very well studied in mediavistics at an unprecedented level, and there are also different reasons that in this sense encompass all over Europe, and regardless of the actual fracture that the reform presented, there was not just a sort of a counter-reformation for that matter, but there are also more unifying traits that Europeans had in common at this point than they hadn't. So actually we still remain that strikingly homogeneous, even in our different national linguistic fashion. We're actually also, in compared to other continents, in many ways, strikingly homogeneous people in many ways, and even in particular, even regardless of our, in fact, individual standing, and that's what makes Europe strong. As a matter of fact, and it's really not to be seen anywhere in the world easily, right? You can't say, I don't know, even where China you have. Again, a uniform kind of ethnicity, which is also somehow debatable and different. Never mind how this was achieved in part. But in that sense, you don't have a plurality. You don't have a a difference within systematic sclerotic. Same for India. Yes, India is somehow composite, and also because there are different religions properly, including Islam next to Hinduism. But in that sense, you don't have real states that really are considerable as European states in their historical independence, right? You have really something very different. At most, you have, in fact, all the colonial offshoots of Europe mirroring partly that, but naturally in very different ways. Countries that are sort of very young and don't. I was just reflecting about this today. In terms of what it means, identically speaking, to belong to a colonial country. It's very interesting to me because also I have sort of great respect, of course, for such places as truly European countries, and in that sense, it really hits you, like to live in places where you're habituated to have, say, okay, well, where we live, it's millennia old. Also heavily and overwhelmingly documented and stratified history, as opposed to, okay, we are an offshoot of that. In fact, I never say, like many Europeans do, I know that most of my audience is American, I say these things also for this reason, but I really mean them, that Americans don't have a history. Well, they have, it's our history. Largely just, again, they have something on top of that is also quite interesting on its own in the last hundreds of years, but we also have all that in common. But anyway, Protestant regions during the early modern age emphasized work ethic and innovation, even though, again, that's a bit a mythology. I mean, you can't look at countries like Scotland or Hungary and saying that their Calvinism was conducive to any particularly high performance, right? Catholic countries were much more advanced in many ways, and they remain also that for a long time, and still in great part it still can be. Like, I don't know, if you consider even just in terms of wealth, Italians are individually, even with the southern part that lowers the average, richer than the Swedes. How do we put this? Like, you have to explain it in some way. And but it is true that surely in countries, think about the Netherlands, England. I mean, these are really the champions in that regard. Like, you have really this work ethic and innovation that, as we explained before, it also does objectively stem from the fact that they broke apart from a more cohesive sort of system, and they exploited what they had relatively available in their at hand, contributing, to say the least, to scientific and cultural progress as Christian countries, with reformers. Again, Calvin is not really my favorite in general, but advocating, checks on powers and congregational governance. That this is important, objectively, to pave the way for, again, modern quote-unquote democratic forms seen in congregationalist colonies, social contracts like the Mayflower Compact, the English Civil War influences, the Glorious Revolution, just to say some little things, and later constitutional monarchy in Protestant nations like Sweden, Norway. Despite schisms, Christianity remained, in fact, Europe's unifying thread, not just as that, like the formal terms indeed, but not only, with saints like Augustine shaping theology through confessions, outlining sinful youth and conversion as the first Western autobiography, influencing medieval worldview and city of God, distinguishing spiritual and earthly realms amid Rome's fall as spiritual city, at least in some temporary view, due to the role that had in upholding the empire that was understood mostly as the earthly dimension of it, not the fact that Rome wasn't, in that sense, also already Christianly as clamorously holy and would remain truly the most important city in the continent. Saint Benedict, structuring monastic life, as we've seen, with prayer and work as a great fact in Western history, enduring today with thousands of monasteries. Francis of Assisi inspiring poverty and charity through his order. The Canticle of the Sun praising creation and peacemaking force during crusades with the Muslims within Christians that often quarreled in this mechanism, but also having a dialogue, as you know, with the the Egyptian sultan at some point. He was very interested by these Christian men of faith, the saints. Dominic, I have really lots of videos about the mendicant orders, the friar minors, founding preachers to combat heresy, the Cathars at the time, through intellectual means and service of friars. Ignatius of Loyola establishing Jesuits for education with a militarized framework. He was, in fact, a veteran himself. Missions, the ensuing missions to India, Japan, China, Canada, Central and South America, Australia, and Counter-Reformation with its spiritual exercises. Catherine Drexel founding orders for indigenous and African-American education, starting Xavier University, and Hildegard of Bingen contributing in the Middle Ages to music, medicine, astronomy, sciences, and visionary theology as a prominent woman with widespread influence. Right? Popes guided moral and political life from medieval times onward, with figures like Gregory VII asserting autonomy in the investiture controversy against imperial appointments, leading to the famous Canossa humiliation of the Holy Roman Emperor in obedience to Rome, Leo XIII issuing Rerum Novarum, defining the workers' dignity and rights to unions in the late 19th century, living wage-rejecting socialism at the same time. This was radically important because it wouldn't be the first time that would bring a necessary union, again, between the sort of different estates, social estates, against a common enemy, such as socialism, Marxism, atheism, and so on. Pius XI, on social order with the Quadragesimo Anno, with solidarity and subsidiarity, noting dangers from, at that point, both, say, what we call capitalism, which is actually a communist term that was imposed on ours in many ways, mostly from, in fact, 19th century, the 19th century socialistic nature, that actually also nationalism, as opposed to the great imperial Catholic tradition, had spread as a radical, terroristic, leftistic ideology from the Fourth Estate's lesser people. Let's never forget this. And so, obviously, also communism, there is no need to stress that. I also recently made a video about the importance of, Pope John Paul II in tearing down, you can argue single-handedly, the Soviet Union. You have Pius XII exploring implications of technology, space, psychology, sport, TV, science. This is the age of our parents. And Lo, in social teachings as Pope of Technology, in fact, and the earlier Boniface VIII, one of the greatest popes in the history of the church, and at the peak of the same in many ways, especially in terms of temporal power. Not much of the pastoral one, like Innocent III was by far the greatest pope, but Boniface VIII is one of those guys that you always find in YouTube videos like, who was the most evil pope, because they don't even know how or why that vision, like there is incredibly successful, in this sense, incredibly praisable propaganda from the political factionalism of the time that, however, sticks just because of modernistic subcultural reinterpretation of things, very often with anti-papism, anti-Catholic feelings, and being the founder also of the University of Rome, and proclaiming papal superiority also over the empire, at least in times in which, or over that sense, also secular rulers. It was paradoxically his ally and, in that sense, competitor, Philip IV, King of France, that obviously incarnated also a sacred idea of royal power, that he quarreled with the most with the unam sanctam, in fact facing arrest and decline in prestige overall, because there was a limit to these sort of contrasts as well. A shared heritage of holy sites, relics, festivals, and pilgrimages bound diverse peoples across our Europe with devotion to the Virgin Mary, securing maternal virtue as a cultural theme from In particular, the 12th century. The 12th century had a very strongly Marian revival teaching with the solo chivalry in parallel. By the way, this is again the same age of Bernard of Clairvaux, of the monastic military orders, teaching tenderness to barbarians. According to Clark, chivalry influenced by church attitudes towards women and protection of the weak through codes of honor and Christian ideals in active charity. So they understand that it's not weakening the man, they were literally being educated, indoctrinated to be literally like some taking down 30 people at a time of the infidels in that sense, but having a disciplining, right, a sort of taming kind of role in the woman as she has in the relationship, because the man is to be complemented by her in an archetypal sense. And so it has to be the opposite, but again, in a fully complementary sense. You have a vast tradition across the millenniums before Christianity, living very well within Christianity itself, with patron saints assigned to places, professions, and causes like Cosmas and Damien for medicine, or George for battles. Right, I am very much connected with Saint John the Baptist. I was born under his sign for different reasons, and my middle name is also John. As a matter of fact, it's my Jewish element within the first name. It is Hellenic, and also at that point, I was connected with Christianity. It's after, well, I can't say which one it is because I'm telling my name, and my surname is Germanic. It actually stems from literally from the berserker. And not sort of by periphrasis. So that's literally what it means. And but you see, these things impact you also as a European. And even though I'm very much connected with St. John the Evangelist on a more intellectual level, but we feel about this. It's something that ancient cultures attributed an enormous importance to, just because you were, in that sense, indeed determined at the moment of your birth by certain things that would, in that sense, characterize you in a way that would guide you along your own personal path towards God, right? That is unique in your own personal sense, and that loads you in responsibility in this very specific declension. You have, I don't know, like you have this kind of connections, but remember, my maternal grandmother was particularly devoted to Saint Margaret. Right, also my cousin actually is called Margaret. She derived from that. So you have these things in family, in identity, in lots of different specific connections. You have, I don't know, causes like Cosmas and Damien for medicine, or St. George for battles. Of course, the former being actual doctors themselves. I come from a family doctor for that matter. And St. George would describe the equestrian sort of ethos, also the beginning of its symbolism in the 3rd century BC, properly emerging in an explicit fashion. Before, of course, St. George was there as a specific name, but being the archetype fully alive from that all the time. Europe, as the cradle of Christian civilization, owes its cultural identity, philosophy, as we said before, to great fathers of the church, in turn inspired by great philosophers of antiquity. Think about Augustine as far as Platonism, Neoplatonism, especially also in his time, Aquinas by Aristotle. In this sense, however, working on them in an original sense, in integrating, in this sense, faith with reason, the more ascetic, the more sort of rational mechanisms that are necessary in the completion of, say, contemplation and action, right? This is very clear also from pre-Christian theology. You can't have an idea of Christianity just contemplation. You do need contemplation, as we explained before with monks, but also with simple education. You have, as we said before, the scholastic methods dominating thought, literature. I mean, as influenced by, for example, Dante's Divine Comedy, that has a very interesting mix of like the Ghibelline tradition and the scholastic Aristotelian Thomistic one, drawing on sacramental theology and biblical structure as epic poetry, the Bible's profound impact on texts, ethics, war, peace, sexual morals, condemning porneia array, such as the same prostitution, sexual slavery, marriage as mutual self-giving, and honor versus dishonor in adultery. Family life with infant baptism in many denominations, confirmation at age of reason, rituals like foot washing or circumcision in Coptic, Ethiopian, Eritrean communities that in that sense derived from essentially, that was a great deal of same Egyptian, I said before, fathers of the desert, but for example, having very strong ties with Rome. Like if you look at, for example, that video that we made on Ethiopian warfare for the early modern age, you realize that they were literally imitating Italian Renaissance painting there. Also in the iconography of St. George, that looked strikingly white for someone living in the Horn of Africa, and obviously having a very specific archetypal meaning. You have really this massive array of civilizational accomplishment, larger households in Christian regions, scientific foundations in monastic schools, universities sponsoring inquiry with respect for dialogue and multiple sides. And so regardless also of the origin of this Levantine Jewish sect, you understand how Europe in particular adopted it as essentially an offshoot of the great universal Catholic tradition and profoundly shaped it as much as it shaped the continent through centuries, in fact, of synthesis, patronage, right? And the accomplishments are so many. I'm glad to make this video because we really needed a bit of this talk for everybody interested. You have the church's role, for example, extended to preserving hygiene and public health, with early Christians promoting bathing rituals and establishing facilities near churches and monasteries separate from sexes. In Byzantine centers like Constantinople and Antioch, contributing to medieval society standards of discipline and cleanliness through charity baths, monastic spas, and encouraged, for example, by Benedict for therapeutic needs. How much we have heard that, medievals did not bathe. This is absolutely not true. There were also incredibly rigid traditions. The insular, the Irish tradition in particular, prescribed an incredibly, brutal form of spiritual discipline through basically icy water that also, especially in northwestern Europe, is not, you don't have much means sort of to warm up outside of it. Rules in orders like Benedictines and Augustinians emphasizing ritual purification, bodily care, and public baths in basilicas. In education, monastic schools and later universities trained generations, fostering disciplines from theology to natural philosophy, while mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans brought learning to urban centers and emphasized poverty alongside scholarship. It's not like this was a counter. Again, as I said before, the concept of capitalism is just like unknown to tradition. It's just free market, right? And if anything, Franciscans and Dominicans were looking at showing moderation as a form of self-discipline, not much poverty just for the sake of that. Poverty has naturally, proper lack of material means makes you spiritually closer to suffering and thus teaching you also the same experience of Christ's passion, because that's the only way to deny yourself to understand how powerful that can be. Like if only in the moment in which you stop fearing death, you will win over the same. And that's also what the Christian principle really is. And this, again, was the older one. There were torturos, for example, initiatory rites in the sacred war bands of classical antiquity. So it's nothing really alien or strange or culturally divergent from what we already knew in the essence and the ultimate goal, right? It's mostly like how you have to achieve that has changed, because also humanity has changed, and therefore so the approach to divinity must take that into account. You have their cathedral schools continuing monastic interest in learning promoted by monasteries and evolving into institutions born from Christian settings that regarded The university as originating in medieval Christian contexts with Latin common language aiding international reach. The Renaissance, motivated by connecting Catholicism with rediscovered Greek thought through pilgrims and translations imported by Christian scholars, produced the masterpieces by Catholic artists that we were talking about before, spent mornings in prayer. For example, we talked about Da Vinci, Raphael, Botticelli, Bernini, Fra Angelico, Tintoretto, Guercino. Rubens attended daily mass, for example, and others blended faith with humanism in works that celebrated divine creation and human potential while conforming to Christian beliefs and stimulating religious fervor through emotional Baroque forms. But we have seen, which was also a product of its specific time for different reasons, but we've seen how alchemy itself was, as astrology, historically well within Catholic tradition. It did not create problems. It created problems only if it created them from a theological point of view, but it didn't on a regular basis, because this was just the same historical reelaboration of the imperial Catholic tradition. It was a rich universal theology that Europe, just like other parts of the world, just had salvaged, and that in Europe found, in fact, its greatest re-expression at this point in history. Protestant contributions enriched literature through figures like Milton with Paradise Lost, Bunyan with Pilgrim's Progress, Donne with metaphysical poetry, Dryden, Defoe, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Dickens, Hawthorne, Eliot, Faulkner, Updike, Spencer, Swift, Goethe, Schiller, Fontaine, Mann, Poe, Irving, Browning, Dickinson, Bronte, Cowper, Watts, Wesley, and Gerhardt in hymns, for example. Music with Luther's hymns spreading congregational singing, Schütz, Purcell, Brahms, Mendelssohn, and others elevating sacred expression in cantatas, oratorios, and classical forms within Protestant culture. The faith's emphasis on the sanctity of life influenced legal protections for the vulnerable, from children through opposition to exposure and infanticide, rarely prosecuted in antiquity but forbidden by church, increasing seriousness of crime to slaves with consistent condemnations, purchases for freedom in earlier centuries, and as we've seen, sovereigns properly outline it in their kingdoms. Christian In fact, the fundamental realization is that Christian culture, deep Christian culture, unequivocal Christian culture, undisputed, unchallenged Christian culture, equated Western civilization for much of history. You may want to reflect on this, that the fact that there was never like a moment in Europe in which basically there was anything that could counter Christianity. As we explained before, the evangelization of the Roman Empire was a sort of millenary process in hindsight, but there was nothing within probably the fabric of Europe that was challenging that. The same heresies of the 12th century that were quelled and defeated, and some of which remerged here and there, but were never able to threaten the core of the imperial Catholic tradition. So here we're talking Christianity in general as well, so you can debate what is Christian, what is not Christian, also in terms of confessions that now sort of are mainstream, but would have been considered heretical at the time, besides sort of many different aspects we could discuss. But what I mean is that it was never a force, like the so-called paganism. Today we didn't talk so much about that in general. You know that I loathe the term to begin with, but by definition that was not threatening, right? In, say, by the early Middle Ages, when a great part of Europe was still not Christian, it's not like that presented like an alternative or a threat or whatever. That's why it's much easier if you start properly absorbing the concept of imperial Catholic tradition pre-existing Christianity, because the difference there is not much between Christianity and pre-Christianity. That's what literally most people think it was about. It's very heavily misinformed. It was between properly the imperial Catholic tradition and those provincial fringe kind of paganistic, intended as properly from the pagi, like from properly the least developed realities that also Rome didn't even need to reach control to rule the world, because of the lack essentially of resources, but moral and material alike in that periphery. There was instead inundated, in that sense, blooming, by and blooming, thanks to the evangelization later. That's what sort of northern Eastern Europe were historically sort of civilized in a broader sense. That overlapped with the evangelization of the process. And it's not like divides wouldn't last, because of course the ones pre-existing were very important. But that's what you want to appreciate. That why do I make this point? Because there is something in this sense absolute in the Christianity of Europe for a lot of her history, right? It wasn't something that was impending, or Christianity that was, I don't know, somehow surviving above the embers that could be reactivated to some other beliefs. This is what the so-called neo-pagans also completely, it's not just the fact that they don't understand it, of course, but it's truly what they don't represent. Because we have arrived to the point that barely even Christians understand actually their own history. You can't imagine people who call themselves neo-pagan and just use that term to describe something that, in fact, it's just a post-traditional, post-modernistic, countercultural fringe whining. It has nothing to do with the actual beliefs of those ruling at the time that were absolutely striving for world domination. And this is perhaps the greatest denial that you can be in if you are thinking that there was anything different in any proper belief at the time. And it's, in fact, a product of the 19th century. Nobody before that believed what these people were believing, at least tendentially, yes, but not even in the form that is basically non-existent even at this point in strictly social cultural terms. Some sort of, again, ghetto fringe phenomenon. It's not really anything substantial from any moral or scientific standpoint of view. Just by it, we have, what I would like to say is that we have a crashingly oceanic amount of historiography on this. Like, so you can't come up with saying, okay, well, this is kind of an opinion. Like, the challenge at this point is just being cultured enough to realize how big the thing was and how much you basically do not know anything about it if you just even try to make those points. Christian culture equated Western civilization for much of history, guiding philosophy, literature, music, and science until the Enlightenment. How do you even explain that? And even after Enlightenment, of course, we live largely in a Christian world, with disciplines developing to Christian philosophy, art, and literature rooted in biblical inspiration and church sponsorship that preserved literacy after Rome's fall through monastic scribes, as we explained. Again, we transmitted Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian cultures to later Europe, single-handedly refounding civilization, at least according to some historians. There was a big collapse at the end of antiquity for different reasons. So the inherent fragility, material fragility, at least of the system, and so when things scale down in moral terms, it opened to a massive crisis. Then it's under Christian Europe that you have the great medieval civilization, that you have the Renaissance, and no actual collapse in between, or something that has destroyed civilization. So many ups and downs, but actually the booming of Western global domination under Christianity. Now, for those who think, by the way, that Christians were meek or whatever, there's no anthropology, even just studying basic history of sort of military history, ethos, values, etc. in Christian times in the Middle Ages, like, there's no evidence whatsoever that Christianity was ever conducive to some sort of meeker form of warfare, as a matter of fact. And that's actually a good thing in that sense. I mean, that's exactly what the military is supposed to do, but also it's something that was just obvious in the military function in humanity in the framework of a universal empire. That's, again, what everybody really believed in, and nobody ever sort of contested. We know well how the Bible profoundly shaped Western law, ethics, and notion of human rights, as well as in teachings like the parable of the Good Samaritan, that, as Thatcher said, like, if the Good Samaritan had not been rich, would have not really given anything, right? To the poor derelict. It's important, by the way, to connect this with the Christian European connection with the rest of the Christian world, because as we were explaining before, there was actually a deep and obvious connection between free Christian territories, with the free Christian people and church, etc., with those that were instead under Islamic control. Eastern Christians preserved and transmitted knowledge to the Islamic world during the Umayyad and Abbasid periods. Right, that's something we tend to also underestimate. Again, the Islamic Golden Age, everybody's culture apparently, well, not quite, but many of these are Christians, and actually made videos explaining how things are less edifying in terms especially of internal fracture. I mean, if the Muslims took over places like the Levant, the same Holy Land and so on, it's because the local churches failed at backing secular authority, very differently from the West, that in fact even over Islam had this massive moral edge of supporting earthly rule and being in fact as a consequence a much more stable system and also a much more thriving one, social, culturally speaking. But you have these Christians during the so-called Islamic Golden Age excelling in translations of Greek philosophers themselves, right? That's also where the connections with, say, I don't know, the Italians, their Reconquista and so on, in the Levant, is where translations, of course, of the same Greek philosophers to Syriac and Arabic at centers like Gunde Shapur with its hospital, pharmacology, laboratory, translation house, library, observatory, and academy blending traditions, contributing to philosophy, science, theology, and medicine with figures from the book tissue family serving even as the caliph's physicians across 8 generations. We're not talking about the Nestorians playing prominent roles in the House of Wisdom. It was a major Islamic sort of central learning and Arab culture. There's all a history beyond that. In China, there's a lot of later European migration during the Pax Mongolica with probably Dominicans in China. And again, we also eventually with the 14th century crisis cut contacts with them. But that Christianity had arrived up to China much before, even in very big numbers. So that's a very interesting history we will have to cover because it's you can't simply forget about its existence. Now, in politics, as we explained, you have the church mediating between rulers and people, with canon law providing a universal framework that outlasted empires, because the church is still here, and especially the Church of Rome really inheriting a dramatic amount of Roman imperial practices before, including, in fact, the juridical one. Again, we tend to forget a bit how in informing European identity as a whole, like this continuous fallout out of the sheer critical mass of the city of Rome's civilizational, cultural, and educational capacity was concerned. Right, this is obvious. It's not just the city of Rome, as we explained. It was obvious, like after the fall of the West, in any case, that from the Mediterranean, of course, the greater elements would spread across the world. But literacy, like Rome herself had expanded continental literacy in Europe, it was something that the Greeks, for example, hadn't really done. So just imagine how this impacted and influenced even the molding of the church, because we don't really talk so much about this, do we? Like how much of that knowledge, of that cultural legacy was inherited directly by the church. This, as we explained, had, for example, juridically speaking, a massive influence on secular laws. We've seen marriage, inheritance, oaths, moral crimes, education, and end-of-life issues. While Inquisitions also revived Roman legal procedures for order amid heresy, concerns using combined panels evolving into the state institutions in Spanish, Portuguese, and Roman forms, with different focuses from medieval responses to dissidents, and notoriously the Inquisition tribunal was by far the most guarantistic, the most fair, the most just in Europe at the time. Maybe if you were taken by some random secular tribunal. He would just be put into prison without much, a procedural form or whatever. In Protestant countries, it would simply be taken on the spot and burned alive. This is overbearingly, overly researched. We know macroscopically well the scalar difference that exists. So think about all the demonization made of this. The Inquisition, the Holy Inquisition spread, for example, enormously a sense of education, literacy, a much better understanding probably of Christian doctrine, and that was wanted by the people. And this was, again, completely a norm if you know what universal institutions had historically been doing since ever in European history. In the most developed parts where actually the Protestant fringe at that point was really a fringe, were still not actually rich at all. And some places wouldn't even ever surpass those countries here. But even statally speaking, the Inquisition was the first common institution that the crowns of Castile and Aragon would become eventually modern Spain as a country had in common. This sort of institutional, administrative, juridical, political synthesis, but deriving largely from the power of Roman control, intervention. We didn't talk about this more than much, right? Especially in the Middle Ages, but the role of the church was overwhelmingly positive in pacifying Europe. Right? When a war between two Catholic countries ravaged them, like the Pope intervened also, of course, with political interest to back this or that contendant, but always in a sort of, okay, if you look at it, zoom in away from it in historical terms, you realize that a great part of how certain countries were preserved, how they also got Christianized on purpose, is instituting ties with Rome in times in which they were under pressure, right? The same pagan Lithuania eventually Christianized, but because of the pressure that the Teutonic Knights were putting on her, so you can't quite attack another Christian country. The Pope is going to excommunicate you if you do something like that. So the overwhelmingly positive stabilizing function that the Church of Rome had in the development of European countries and states, it's something magnitudinal in scale, and it incredibly clever, incredibly sophisticated, well connected, so very far from being something positively dysfunctional or oppressively usurpatory or parasitic of some sort. Family life transformed, as we've seen under Christian influence. You can see the role of women in the inner circles of Jesus, imparting teachings in present and crucifixion. We know by this point fairly well what that archetypal meaning had really. You have the Gregorian calendar, for example, adopted worldwide as the civil calendar through Pope Gregory XIII's reform, correcting the Julian discrepancies tied to the Easter equinox, measuring time from Jesus' estimate birth, underscoring Christianity's global imprint on civil life, alongside public holidays for Christmas and Easter in Western nations, marking key festivals with Paschal Triduum for that, for example. Today we haven't even talked about how much Christianity saw, of course, the imperial Roman inheritance, right, with Christ's birth under Augustus' reign, and the echoes in Virgil's references to the New Age ushered in because of the birth of the new Apollo and so on. There is all a massive imperial Catholic tradition and properly evangelical meaning. I mean, the Augustan worldview was deeply evangelical. The fact that Rome had fixed the sin of the civil wars that had brought, in fact, God chosen people to spill his own blood in a truly ecumenic sense, right? It's not, then this had to be spread. Think about the res gestae of the Divus Augustus. The fact that Christianity was born under his reign, that at least Christ was born under his reign and developed later in the wake of the same, like it's something impossible to unsee. It's impossible to detach from the wall, which narratively is what, unfortunately, it's done by many people to sort of also belittle certain certain these aspects. We have Cistercians, right? Various congregations spreading, like, catalyzing, for example, market economy in Europe with enterprise spirit, collecting vast farmlands, owing significant portions with taxes collected on large scale, so facilitating also further statal build-up. You have also in the different traditions here, we are looking at different eras. Think about the role of women in vital roles as nurses in Methodist and Catholic contexts, right? As diaconesses as well. Even the notion of progress as a God-given obligation tied to the gift of reason entailed in creation and Christian conviction that new technologies would always come, spur technological and economic developments, even in medieval Europe, from improved production methods, water mills driven, as we were saying before, by water mills, navigation, war technology, clocks, sailing ships. Those were always accepted without condemnation, unlike in non-Western societies. You have Christian theater, through mystery plays and morality dramas in medieval times evolving to Christian drama, proper business through fair practices, origins in temple orders like the King Templars for finance, the mounts of piety, social measures from 1462, the Apostolic Chamber, the involvement also of probably Christian world. Like, think about banking, the Medici, the Fugard, Welser, Simonetti, Schroeders, Berenbergs, also in Protestant banking as well. That is the hallmark in many ways also of that aforementioned economic propulsion. Politics through doctrines of just rule, resistance to tyranny, developed by reformers influencing absolutism opposition. You have the fostering of exchange with pilgrims and scholars crossing borders to holy relics and sites and complexes like Cluny, influencing widespread dependencies through vibrant centers of learning, piety, and architectural beauty. Right, considered among the most beautiful styles with dependencies throughout Europe. What else to remember? Too many things. Catechism in general, I guess, yet another form of spreading literacy. You have this, the lesser magistrate doctrine used later in declarations of independence. That distancing of church and state convictions further began among early Protestants, pioneering the sense of, again, non-Christian and, say, ecclesiastical interference, as far as a more lay state was involved. And there you have also, in fact, the spread of, especially of mercantile, say, probably modern banking. Think about the Barings, the Lloyds, but great Christian artists like Dürer, Holbein, Cranach, Rembrandt, Van Gogh, even. Alongside Protestant culture impacting all aspects of life. They have Anglicanism with its Book of Common Prayer, presence in Europe through diocesan and expatriate communities, Lutheranism prevalent in Nordic countries, northern Germany with exclusive forms there, and up to 60 millions, Calvinism in Reformed, Presbyterian, and congregational forms predominant in Switzerland, Netherlands, Scotland, and minorities elsewhere with 10 million. Methodism as a minority in Britain and Ireland with Welsh emphasis, and other denominations enriching Europe's religious landscape with united Protestant churches merging traditions in many regions like Germany, France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Switzerland with 12 million members and affiliated Christians estimated at 20 million. And growing evangelicals, Pentecostal, and charismatics at 69 million, adding further variation. But in this sense, Christianity's legacy in Europe encompassing this rich tapestry of denominations, Catholics remain prevalent, right? And this is one of the most important aspects in the continuity of the imperial Catholic tradition, imperial universal tradition. They are, in particular, predominant in the south and the west of Europe, with also majorities or large populations in other countries. Here we're talking mostly Poland, Italy, Spain, Ireland, Portugal, France, Austria, Croatia, Lithuania, Slovenia, Hungary, Slovakia, Malta, Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Monaco, San Marino, Andorra. Significant minorities in the Netherlands, Eastern Southern Germany, Western Southern Switzerland, Central Southern. In Germany, Catholics are actually prevalent as well. Ukraine in the West, the Uniate Church of Ukraine, made lots of videos about that, which is also incredibly important as far as, in fact, showing that there is an Eastern church at some point came back to Rome, which is something at least you don't hear too often. In the west of Belarus, there are also Catholics. Central, southwestern Bosnia, Albania. We could say Czech Republic because there are these countries also that are somehow irreligious. For example, Catholicism is prevalent among the Christian Czechs. But we're talking just like a minute, like it's like even less than 10%. So there is all naturally a history of post-socialism. You have important minorities of Catholics, of course, in the United Kingdom, in Serbia, in Romania. Right. Then you have obviously the broader Orthodox world, like just by pool. You have Russia as by numbers, obviously the largest Christian country by population, except in practice, you have to really look at what this population is and how actually believing this is. For example, I don't know, Ukraine is a much more conservative country, so much more religious country. So what does it mean to be a Christian? Well, it really varies as you understand now, and actually like the entire point is a bit sort of complicated to assess. You have Germany and Italy are de facto still strong Christian countries, but the Christianity is very fundamental to so many different countries, even some that you wouldn't think, even just by different reasons. For example, even smaller countries like Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, they all have a incredibly old Christian tradition. Romania, Ukraine, as I was saying before, with the Uniate Church as well, Cyprus, Georgia, Moldova, Montenegro, North Macedonia, Kazakhstan, because that was, again, the land of largely Turks at the time, but eventually they were injections of Europeans and during Tsarist Empire. And so you have, again, other countries that have historically some particular minorities of Orthodox in Albania, Estonia, Finland, Lithuania, and Poland, Armenia, with in the latter Oriental majority, because there are, of course, churches who maintain some kind of national affiliations. You've seen Armenia was the first country to become officially Christian, and so it has also its own church. In Protestants, as well as the novelty, so to say, in historical hindsight, chronologically in the north, with strongholds in Scandinavia, including exclusive Lutheranism in Nordic countries, Germany, Central, Eastern, Northern, as you know, the least developed parts historically, the richer South and West were Catholic. Think about there also how Romanization impacted this. I mean, in a sense, it was not necessarily just meant in Christian terms, but I explained there in truly Catholic terms. For the Universal Empire, England, obviously, the Netherlands, Central and Northern, mostly Switzerland, except the South, Iceland. You have Protestant minorities in Estonia, Latvia, France, northeastern Italy, Slovakia, Hungary, western southern Germany, Czech Republic, Poland, Serbia, Romania. So, united in core beliefs that forge a distinctive identity, accomplishments in culture, knowledge from preserved texts through monastic scribes who refounded civilization to scientific revolution motivation. You may think this part to be confusing because, again, I decided not to insist very much on the divisions that are objectively not predominant. Actually, there is this very core, like it's relevant for the legacy that we were drawing in an imperial Catholic sense, but what's still striking is how similar Christians are to one another, especially in Europe. So they're united in core beliefs that forge a distinctive reality, accomplishments in culture and knowledge from the preserved text to monastic scribes who refounded civilization to scientific revolutions, motivations, Nobel laureates disproportionately identifying also with Christian preferences across peace, chemistry, medicine, economics, and literature, with high percentages and roots tracing back to ancient beginnings, enduring as a predominant force, really, of Christianity shaping the continent's history, heritage, and contributions to global civilization through philosophy, welfare, arts, ethical frameworks, education systems, all originating in Christian settings. Medical care sponsorship, managing vast networks, family values, emphasizing larger households in many regions. As Christians, legal traditions from sanctity of life to canon foundations, predating common and civil law, and a profound sense of human dignity, purpose, community, and unified identity that linked Europe as Christendom for centuries while influencing cultures beyond in Africa, Asia, the Americas, through missions, translation, and shared heritage, values, institutions, and progress. I surpassed the 2 hours. I usually don't force it, but it's obvious that from a video like this, so many different other aspects could be highlighted, perhaps in other videos. I thought that as a Christmas video, this was quite fitting, but also quite relevant in a much broader sense. Chiefly, look at what it meant. I understand that it seems like the world is falling apart, and it is actually falling apart. This is what the Christian tradition, also the Catholic tradition before that, has always, already before that and continuing within it, has always known, right? The point, though, is showing how, in this sense, disciplined, compact, more traditional, more cultured, more educated, more successful, actually, Christian communities are in this world. And this is the aspect that we seem not even to insist too much on. What is that makes it that effective? It's difficult to explain this, and it's relatively easy when you understand what God is supposed to be. Whoever sort of manages to fully believe is God himself, and there is something naturally wanting in our approach to that. And so Christians acknowledge this and therefore strive towards the truth, strive towards God, knowing perfectly that God is there. It's something incredible. There are so many different personal experiences that can lead you to that, and just mixing, proper upbringing, which is a challenge, again, because many people weren't brought up Christian, but we realize that they are re-Christianing right now in a way that hadn't been seen before, that overall religion for everyone is on the fall. And this is not good, even for those sort of, therefore, half of religions that emerge as a consequence. But in this sense, there is something even about our education, our history, as a history channel, my first concern is obviously, look at the past, because it's not like this tradition is found in some strange ideal or empirical or rationalistic approach to religion. Unfortunately, I follow a lot of American political commentaries, and aside from sort of looking at a complete disaster that, in that sense, YouTube or X have become, this massive crisis of purpose, it's impossible not to sort of familiarize with that Christian context in which you were brought up, regardless of even your familial associations, as we're realizing how much of a better world it was and what kind of beliefs were upheld. There is also the problem that of people literally not knowing this. So a video like this, for example, is, say, warranted for a moment like this, for a channel that has naturally discussed Christian history in great depth and width, and that will keep doing so. Given the recent overload of specials, we have sort of slightly abandoned the cycle, but we will come back with that. And there's, as always, a lot of Christian history. Now, in many ways, the point, though, being that there is a rich evidence, right? Aside from theology, if you don't study Christian theology, it's going to be a bit difficult to understand, Shakespeare or Dante or, any work that in that sense, it's not speaking simply of some sort of Christian sectarian reference. It's speaking of a universal value. And this is what I discovered most people have come to understand the world through. It's some sort of tagging people through different boxes that, however, lose meaning in the moment in which you over categorize them and you basically fixate on that, as opposed to understand whether any of that has any substance or worth, what kind of form they have, or what kind of inspiration they have. And so tradition as a compact hierarchical organization, and as something you can fact check just in a historical, even just properly educational sense, it's something that greatly helps recovering sense of properly of Christianity and its deeper original meaning. And even before Christianity, I say this often, that one of the few things that priests know today is that tradition predates Christianity, right? That the Christian is obsequious towards something that existed before Christ. Obviously, in the Bible, like the entire interreferences between Old and New Testament are abundantly clear and coherent, actually, regarding the pre-existence of Christ in as much as God. And so here we enter again theological, how that is possible, and what are, if anything, the implications of that, rather within Christianity itself, and also the veterotestamentary tradition. But let's say the point is understanding how truly universal and originary the meaning is, how even when you study history of religion and you compare this different beliefs and so on, this is not a matter of exclusivism or this radical, like there are, let's say, meanings that transcend at least the conventional way we have could come to know these religions, right? So that people, again, feel mostly affiliated, Christianly speaking, as to a group rather than anything. And there is actually a meaning that goes beyond that, not because it's undermining, the concept of family, nation, or more. Actually, it's sublimating it because it speaks to your own individual, personal agency, right? You have an active part in this. You can't really make the mechanism work. And it's difficult to talk Christianity. It's not easy at all. Its success, in my opinion, it is contained exactly within the even properly provocatory paradox that it entails. And this is something we'll see better in other videos, but there is also a plainer view that you can have of it, because the controversy mostly arises from how we have been presented Christianity, which is largely sort of not different from itself, but from the way you've at least been mostly superficially exposed to that. In most times, I'm sure that there are lots of can say theology experts. It's not like I can't imagine that from being a thing, but let's say lots. I received also throughout the years normally this very sort of heartfelt, sort of by the people who were writing comments regarding things like, I don't know, you're more useful to convert to Catholicism than a priest. These kind of statements. And of course, like, this channel, I realize, has grown in very peculiar ways and terms, and there is something really unique about the content I make, and you will not find similar explanations online. I must tell you, at this point, it's not even going to necessarily help us, because we've always been a niche channel, but it's not niche to the degree the topic is to the degree the topic is absolute in itself. It's mostly niche because of what people deem, unfairly so, to be more or less relevant, as opposed to, in fact, what it should really be. So Christian history will remain always a cornerstone of our content, together with a lot that is in any case entwined with it. Because you can't sort of look at this millennia of Christian history, and in this sense of Christian European history, and simply say, oh, this was an accident. That is sort of the more strikingly odd thing that I see in people today. This Christianity, that they don't even reason in how or why that happened, right? They just say, okay, well, it was a thing, and it's like, I don't know what my grandmother believed. And now I don't care, because literally my mental horizons in chronological depth, in historical, with our, my decades of existence, without realizing, can you satisfactorily explain in a spiritual, anthropological, historical, politological, sociological, cultural, educational, etc. sense why for millennia Europe was Christian, and what was achieved by essentially that is most of what you see today as well, at least in the, you can't say the vestiges, but in what is sort of gradually the perishing across the entire world, telling the truth, as also was emanated by Western tradition without anything capable of replacing it, even remotely. And simply saying, oh, well, but I don't care, because I personally, no, it's too difficult to believe in these things, or I don't care, or it requires some standards personally that you're not willing to have, because, of course, you say, maybe you do not know absolutely anything about history. There were times in this channel which I used to say, well, to answer people asking me, how do you start when you want to learn history? Today, even the concept of history is not quite there as we understood it just up to a decade ago, I would say. And the younger generations are hungry of meaning or knowledge, and even though there seems to be some kind of rewiring on other sources of sort of information, these are evidently lacking. They're evidently instrumental. They're evidently empty. They don't care absolutely about providing with anything sound, certain, valuable, effective, traditional, properly documentable. And this is, again, probably the greatest problem of it all. And it's also something that, in fact, can't be, I would say, denied in a broader sense. I think we should really recover that, and we should really present this in ways that can give people a reason to believe once again. It's difficult, again, because they don't have the time to listen to 2 hours of Christian history. But that's why I leave the stuff out there, because you will always find someone who's going to listen to this, and the hope is that, given the difference between my content, pretty much all the rest that I see on YouTube, that somebody is going to finally understand and get it, right? Which is something that you really want to sort of appreciate, just for the fact that it's complete. I don't leave you just with this and saying, oh, why does it not the case? Like, our Christian history playlist is so full, and we will make lots of other videos on specific figures as well that must unavoidably be discussed when talking about probably this specific aspect of European identity. Again, if you don't have that historical awareness for saying, why is European identity Christian and what happened in between, say, if you're not familiar with a geography, you don't know the saints' lives, to you it will always remain a niche topic, but it doesn't mean that it is. It doesn't mean that these people didn't exercise a magnitudinal moral power over Europe, and you must explain how that was, because that's the same source of power according to tradition, even pre-Christian one. So you can't absolutely do without it. And if we recover, especially the centrality of Europe that I see here, I have people following me from mostly either European or colonial countries, so to say, but so in any way there is a connection with Europe. Even if, say, I don't know, your ancestor is somewhere else. I had beautiful debates with Western people that were, just Western from maybe a couple of generations, or some Q&As from a guy from that has Southeast Asian origins, right? Lives in the United States, is American. They were brilliant questions because they were fully Western, they were fully American in many ways. And so you can have this beautiful sort of range. You can't discuss with history with, I don't know, a Chinese person objectively. And I don't think it's possible. First of all, I've never done it, but I've heard terrible things. I mean, I remember there was a Chinese, how do you call it, like exchange student at our university back in the day, and never met her, but my tutor that tutored her, medieval history, by the way, used the term religion because she was explaining her a bit more personally in the office, like what is it, because she didn't understand much about anything in also cultural terms. And my tutor literally used the term religion, and this girl said, "What is religion?" Literally. So you can't have a conversation with someone like it's incredible. It's brutal. I mean, and those are the moments in which you truly realize what it means to be a European. You truly realize what it means to be a Westerner. You can't have, like, also here the things get to do. You can't have a normal debate about these things with, I don't know, with a person living in Russia. There are probably there is a want, there is a lack, probably a deficiency in some major social cultural tools that you can't make up for. And communism destroyed any trace of tradition, actually. We said before, we say these are Christian, are they? Because aside from the skyrocketing levels of atheism, of abortion, of divorce, of familial violence, 6% of the population living in slavery, a rampant paranoia aside from the socio-economical collapse in general, lack of birth crisis at the same time. So all the things that you would think, oh, well, the West is dying. What is happening in this? They're collapsing much worse than we do. But in this sense, like, what is that makes us instead who we are? That's something very precious that you can see there. And again, I had some beautiful interactions, like largely like on YouTube, just through comments of people for understanding how encompassing this thing is. For example, in a recent Q&A, I was asked by, I think the same guy said before, about Black America and how because this person makes all questions about ethnicity, identity, all these kind of things throughout history. And I was answering that. I was saying banally also what should be notorious, that historically Black America was profoundly Christian and conservative, right? And there was a guy from you that is mixed, like American, so from like wherever you want to go, like, he's part of the Black community, but he also looks basically white, among various things. And he thanked me because he said, thanks for pointing this out. Thanks for pointing. He didn't explicitate that too much. I don't remember even the exact words, but what struck me is that obviously this gratitude stemmed from having nailed one sort of majorly identity gluing factor that puts everything together, that does make sense in a higher, greater sense. And so how don't you use this? Sort of how don't you appreciate like the strong connection that makes the West what it is? You can't really understand it if you start treating Christianity as a matter of a cultural sort of a fashion, a trend. That's unfortunately what kids literally brainwashed and neurologically rewired by social media that are completely incapable of realizing. And therefore, I hope, like, I'm not saying that, maybe these are going to be watched by particularly young people, but we have them from the analytics I see from, the max, the minimum is 18, but God knows how many younger people actually, they never really interacted with it, they never properly manifested, even in the earlier years when you would think maybe they were sort of more mature. But I see, in any case, that even if you're 18, you're very, very young. There are people following. I have more people following, mostly my age group. I have actually older people in their, sort of, they're mature, elderly, that they make up a much more consistent part of the very younger. People in their 20s, their 30s, yes, they do follow me in some way, but mostly, like, I'm also worried that earlier generation is going to, this newer generation is going to be completely lost in many ways. And so it's a bit of a gamble, because if they're not interested, if they're already lost, it's not really such a great one to invest, right? Also for audience and whatever. But in any case, it's not like a reason in those terms when I make the videos. But I really hope, if anything, that in fact this content is consumed by people who want to grow through that. And as you understand here, not for rhetorical issues. Like when I talk about Christianity, I never really revealed in 2,600 videos anything about my spiritual background, where I come from, what I actually believe in general about these things. Certain things are evident, I would say. But it's not like I've been making this Christian history content simply in a say, okay, well, I'm Christian, I'm super Christian, I go to Mass, I was brought up Christian, I believe in this. I never even properly voiced any of this. Nor you should give for granted that it's the case at all, because, again, some of you have addressed me as if, I can't say this much, that I'm Catholic. This is true. And I mean, I'm Catholic because in any case, regardless of my beliefs, I would be Catholic before I was Christian. And again, most people, this statement here is beyond even conventional understanding. And I know that it's actually notorious if you have some minimal education in sort of history of religion, of sort of thought, of tradition. You know what that means. There are lots of people who think that they are first Catholic and then Christian, right? That much, yes. It is also impossible not to be, I would say. Then Christianly speaking, even from at least a cultural background, it's obvious. So you have to understand that my voice, as sort of within a specific context, is in this sense capable of telling you the story as if I literally was from the outside, and so had come from outside of it to tell you what it is. And you know that I don't make really, I can be biased, but I don't make propaganda in this sense. I'm not here to wrestle with, other denominations or, some sort of confessional struggle just per se. It's obvious that I disagree with certain positions, but my point is primarily, as I always say, also with tradition, to expound this, to literally explain. It was a thing I had since I was a kid. Like, I wanted, if anything, for myself to understand what things are. And I was never satisfied with other people's explanation. So I had to find out my own, and eventually putting it out here, which I hope is gonna really work out in somehow some successful way. Naturally, I really hope that you appreciated this video that is merely introductory, merely, what it is, as you've seen. If you have arrived here, my compliments with patience. The hope is that you've been having really a great Christmas, surrounded by people you love, or even if you're alone, like really cherishing this time of the year, cherishing the meaning of the holidays. Remember, holidays is absolutely acceptable as a term because there are multiple holidays in Catholicism, especially during the Christmas season. But anyhow, and in fact, trying to think here, what it meant for so many people for such a long time, and what was there even before that. And so I have this beautiful setting outside, and I see today it's been really, bad weather, but it's exactly, the Christmas one. You can see the mountains from here. You can see the trees that have a landscape stretching very many tens of kilometers just from the window. It's beautiful to watch, and I work from here. This is my living room, and it's it makes me think. When I turn even this as I'm recording, I look at that and say, there is something that transmits me, like in this plenitude, and in looking at the horizons of Europe here, how much of a spirit really informs, protects, has this aura over us. And I think this is real power. real love, real life. And that's the reason why I really wish you, again, a Merry Christmas with all my heart, really, to all of you. I really mean it. I really care. And even if I don't know you, obviously I care in theory, but I do still. And remember, the theory, the form, is actually more important than the substance, and sort of the practice to an extent, at least. The pattern here is what matters, and therefore, again, I wish you a splendid Christmas, a splendid time, also for the new the new year, of course. And then if you celebrate the Epiphany, if you celebrate our, obviously, very much from different traditions, from all confessions, because there are very also different national traditions in Europe. There's this the Slav. There are lots of different ways of celebrating it. So I will probably make some videos that you will like in different ways, as you will see now, for the end of the year in particular, and surprises here and there. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope really that you had a great Christmas. It will not say it, the will thing I use at the end. So again, Merry Christmas for Schwerpunkt. I'll see you in the next days. Bye.